Good afternoon, and thank you for coming. I'm Jim Carolyn. I'm the president of the Friends of FAI, which is sponsoring our talk tonight. I wanted to do two things. I wanted to tell you a little bit about Friends of FAI, and then I wanted to introduce Professor Orlando. So Friends of FAI is an organization that supports Italy's largest charity after the Vatican. We have 170,000 members in Italy and maintain about 60 properties, and undertake to open to the public thousands of properties every year through two events that happen in the spring and the fall called the Days of Spring and the Days of Autumn. And the US organization is small by comparison. We've had a long and lovely association with the Casa. The Baronessa who donated the Casa interceded for us and saw that we would have a little place here. So we have, not only great admiration for the work that Stefano does, but we have this long and deep, profound, really, relationship. So every year we help support graduate students with travel grants in the Italian department. So that's a little bit about us. Now I want to tell you about our speaker. Emily Orlando is one of the nation's premier Edith Wharton scholars. Wharton, as I'm sure you know, was a lover of Italy, and her work exemplifies the importance of Italy in the American scene. And for us, that's very important, because essentially that's our mission, to bring Italy and recognition of its cultural patrimony to an American audience. Professor Orlando is the author of an award-winning book, Edith Wharton and the Visual Arts, from 2007, and the co-editor of an essay collection entitled Edith Wharton and Cosmopolitanism, and numerous articles and book chapters on Wharton and her contemporaries. Her current project is to edit, annotate, and write the introduction for the first scholarly edition of Wharton's writings on architecture, design, and gardens, and in particular her early works, the decoration of houses and Italian villas and their gardens, which remain important contributions and were what got us thinking that we should ask her to come and talk about Wharton. Emily's the recent past president of the Edith Wharton Society, and in 2018, she was appointed as the Gerald Corrigan Endowed Chair in the Humanities and Social Sciences at Fairfield University, where she currently teaches. Please join me in welcoming Professor Orlando as she guides us through her talk on One Long Vision of Beauty, Italy and the Aesthetics in Edith Wharton.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. I owe a great debt of thanks to Professor Marian Carolyn, to Jim Carolyn, to Amanda Kuttner, Julian, all of the people that made this talk possible. And thank you for family and friends and former students who have shown up to come out and talk about Edith. So I'm going to advance to the next slide, which will explain the origin of the title. So this is a quotation from a letter that Edith Wharton wrote to her beloved governess Anna Ballman from Rome. We think it's around 1886, and she writes as follows: "It was one long vision of beauty from morning until night, and the mixture of tropical vegetation with the clouds of spring blossoms on the fruit trees and the budding green of willows, figs, and larches made the landscape gorgeous." And here she is. So, the first woman to earn the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, an honorary doctorate from Yale University, and full membership in the American Academy of Arts and Letters, Edith Wharton, whose dates are here for us, 1862 to 1937, remains one of the most popular and critically acclaimed American writers of the past century. In 1920, the year she published her prize-winning novel, The Age of Innocence, on the heels of a well-received travel book on Morocco, the New York Times called her, quote, one of the foremost contemporary writers of English prose. That the Times did not relegate her to the category of women writers is a detail that would have pleased her, and a point to which I will return later. With a life bracketed by the Civil War on the one end and the rise of Nazi Germany on the other, Edith Wharton saw astonishing social and cultural change in her native country, the US, and abroad, including the Gilded Age, the Progressive Era, and a second industrial revolution. Wharton published around 48 books across many literary genres, including novels, short fiction, poetry, drama, travel writing, memoir, and literary criticism. While Edith Wharton would become recognized as a consummate master of fiction with the 1905 publication of her critically and commercially successful novel, The House of Mirth, what is less known is that by the start of the 20th century, she had earned credibility in the fields of architecture and interior decor with the release of the highly influential design treatise, The Decoration of Houses, 1897, and shortly thereafter, 2 books on Italy, Italian Villas and Their Gardens, which is 1904, and Italian Backgrounds, 1905. Of course, Wharton's upbringing as a member of the New York aristocracy provided an unlikely passport to the world of American letters. She was born Edith Newbold Jones into the fashionable family, which we think was associated with the expression keeping up with the Joneses, a phrase that encourages the very acquisitiveness against which the decoration of houses actually would preach. So I like to sort of remind my students that before we had to keep up with them, we had to keep up with the Joneses. One can only keep up, after all, if one has the finer things the moment that they become available for purchase. With the pedigree that ensured her a spot in the New York 400, the size of which was informed by the number of persons accommodated by Mrs. Astor's ballroom, Edith's vocation, precisely like that of her heroine Lily Bart from The House of Mirth, would have been to marry well and serve a husband as a decorative ornament and a self-effacing hostess, and surely not an intellectual peer committed, as she would prove to be, to the life of the mind. A dilettantish, acquisitive interest in art was typical of Wharton's age and her leisure class. For instance, the newly moneyed heroine of The Custom of the Country, quote, acquires as much of the jargon as a pretty woman needs to produce the impression of being well informed, and thus to ensnare a spouse. While Wharton made a socially acceptable marriage to the affable Bostonian, Teddy Wharton, which ended in divorce after 28 difficult years, she managed to forge for herself an identity as an accomplished artist and an authority on aesthetics. At least 3 things made this possible. First, Edith's exposure at a young age to her father's library, where she immersed herself in the works of such writers as Anna Jameson, Franz Kugler, John Ruskin, Walter Pater, Sir Joshua Reynolds, along with her lifelong love of learning, which she continually nurtured. And second, her close friendships with art critics and collectors, Vernon Lee, who was born Violet Paget, Charles Eliot Norton, Bernard and Mary Berenson, Kenneth Clark, Edgerton Withrop, and the list goes on, which afforded her access to the visual arts by way of their conversations and their collections. And third, her annual pilgrimages to France, Italy, Germany, and Spain. On her visits to Italy, Edith carried with her books on the 18th century by Vernon Lee, again, the pen name of Violet Paget, these influences complementing the instruction received at the hands of tutors and governesses laid the groundwork for Wharton's cosmopolitan sensibility and helped develop her into a self-made art historian and interior designer of the highest order. As her most recent biographer, Hermione Lee, notes, quote, 3 of her pallbearers would be museum directors. In travel writings, Wharton refers with dexterity to such Italian Renaissance artists as Bellini, Carpaccio, Botticelli, Botticini, Piero di Cosimo, etc., and so on. She admired the Carracci and revered Tiepolo, Longhi, and Guardi. Her writings reveal a lifelong interest in and a remarkably vast knowledge of Italian visual culture, which provides one of the richest contexts for appreciating her work. As a teenager, Wharton spent what she called rapturous hours making the memorable acquaintance of several Italian paintings at London's National Gallery. Viewing Titian, Leonardo, and Giorgione at the Louvre, Wharton experienced what she called the first rush of sensation, as though, quote, all the great waves of the sea of beauty were breaking over me at once. She relishes the memory of hours spent absorbing art in Venice, quote, the thrill of delight at the first sight of the marble tomb of Ilaria del Carretto at Lucca, and the joy of puzzling out the stories of the frescoes at Santa Maria Novella in Florence. And this again, was a piece that's very important to her. And she, if you know anything about Wharton, you might know that she's a lover of dogs. And this may have inspired one of her Gothic tales called Kerfil, which is totally worth a read. Having spent a number of her childhood years living in Rome and Florence, she was engulfed in and absorbed by European art, architecture, and landscapes. The writings of John Ruskin, the preeminent 19th-century art critic whose influence is felt in the works of William Morris, Walter Pater, Oscar Wilde, and W.B. Yeats, helped Wharton process her early exposure to the European scene. Describing her discovery of the formidable art historian in her father's library, Wharton notes, quote, his wonderful cloudy pages gave me back the image of the beautiful Europe that I had lost, and woke in me the habit of precise visual observation. She notes that Ruskin, quote, fed me with visions of Italy for which I had never ceased to pine. She acknowledges the, quote, incomparable service his work did for her developing aesthetic. Ruskin's books Stones of Venice and Mornings in Florence endowed Wharton with what she called, quote, a sense of organic relation which no other books attainable by me at that time could possibly have conveyed. His modern painters invested Wharton with the language with which to analyze and critique visual culture. But Wharton did not always agree with Ruskin. In the Decoration of Houses, the 1897 design manual that put Edith Wharton on the map as an authority on domestic decoration, she and her co-author, the architect Ogden Codman Jr., criticized the great master for compromising symmetry and balance in design. It is from Italy, after all, that Wharton drew her appreciation of symmetry, noting, quote, that the very air in Italy is full of architecture. Of Italy, she confessed, quote, I never weary of driving, looking at doorways, windows, courtyards, and walls. What an unerring sentiment for form. While conceding that Ruskin's value as a guide through the byways of art is unparalleled, Wharton and Codman note that, quote, as a logical exponent of the causes and effects of the beauty he discovers, his authority is certainly open to question. In Italian backgrounds, Wharton takes issue with John Ruskin for steering travelers away from good art. To her mind, the traveler who follows Ruskin does so at the expense of overlooking what ought not to be overlooked. Quote, even the lax eclectic, she writes, who nurses a secret weakness for the Baroque and rejoices in the last frivolous flowering of the 18th century, finds little immediate satisfaction for his tastes. In Italian Villas and Their Gardens, Wharton reminds us that even the architects Vignola and Palladio, two great masters of the 16th century, have been held up as examples of degeneracy to a generation bred in what she calls the Ruskinian code of art ethics. So while Ruskin and other art historians had dismissed Italian art of the High Renaissance and Baroque, Wharton harbored what she called a secret weakness for these so-called degenerate traditions. Wharton, for example, validates the sculptor and architect Bernini as the genius of the Baroque style. And I quote her here, to those who study his work in the light of the conditions which produced it, he will appear as the natural interpreter of that sumptuous bravura period when the pomp of a revived ecclesiasticism and the elaborate etiquette of Spain were blent with a growing taste for country life, for the solemnities and amplitudes of nature. Wharton reserves a special place for Bernini in her corpus. Her early Gothic short story called The Duchess at Prayer, for example, centers around a fictional Bernini sculpture of a penitent wife kneeling in prayer, which seems to be inspired by the ecstasy of St. Teresa. In Italian Villas and Their Gardens, Wharton celebrates him as, quote, the greatest Italian architect and sculptor of the 17th century. Wharton was unusual in her admiration of artists who otherwise had been disregarded. For instance, she writes in Italian Backgrounds, quote, the germs of Bernini and Tiepolo must be sought in the Sistine ceiling and in the Moses of San Pietro in Vincoli, however much the devotees of Michelangelo may resent the tracing of such a lineage. Wharton had little patience for that peculiar form of intolerance which refuses to recognize in art the general law of growth and transformation, or while recognizing it, considers it a subject for futile reproach and lamentation. So in tracing the lineage of a Baroque artist to the acknowledged master Michelangelo, Wharton not only was working against the grain, but she was also ahead of her time. Wharton was most taken aesthetically and historically with the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Her love of Renaissance and Baroque palaces and their traditional gardens is everywhere evident in Italian Villas and Their Gardens and Italian Backgrounds. Wharton seems to have acquired her appreciation of 18th century Italy as a young adult. Vivian Russell notes that, quote, as she was sitting for her portrait in Paris, a chair in the studio caught her eye as less skillful in execution than French furniture, but more appealing for its, quote, freer, more individual movement. Inquiry revealed that it was Venetian and belonged to the much neglected 18th century. Always curious about the unusual, Edith made 18th century Italy the focus of her study. Wharton reserved particularly high praise for Tiepolo, 18th century painter of the Venetian Baroque. She describes with reverence Tiepolo's ceiling frescoes in Venice, notwithstanding that the guidebooks disapprove of, quote, an undue admiration of Tiepolo. She recognizes Tiepolo, whose name, she asserts, quote, is familiar to the cultivated minority of travelers, as a descendant of Titian and Veronese, a claim that at one time may have sounded blasphemous. She lauds Tiepolo's work thus, quote, here we are. So, studied in the light of Venetian painting, Tiepolo is seen to be the direct descendant of Titian and Veronese. If the intervening century has taken something from the warmth of his color, leaving it too often chalky, where that of the Renaissance was golden, he has recovered the lines, the types, and the radiant majesty of the Venetian Cinquecento, and Veronese's Venus enthroned in the ducal palace is the direct forebear of his virgins and Cleopatras. In Italian Backgrounds, Wharton mentions Tiepolo over a dozen times, extolling especially the virtues of his frescoes in Venice's Church of the Gesuati, which depict Saint Dominic receiving the Rosary. Lily Bart, in Wharton's novel The House of Mirth, considers modeling her tableau vivant on Tiepolo's Cleopatra, and Tiepolo's art would later figure prominently in Wharton's 1922 novel, The Glimpses of the Moon. Wharton's command of that neglected period in Italian art led to a major discovery concerning Italian sculpture. During a visit to Florence, Wharton and her husband, Teddy, trekked to the country to investigate a group of large terracottas depicting Christ's Passion at the San Vivalvo Monastery. Originally, the formidable Harvard art historian Bernard Berenson and others had ascribed these figures to the 17th century sculptor Gonelli. But the attribution was out of step with Wharton's understanding of Italian art, and I quote her here. She writes, the careful modeling of the hands, the quiet grouping, so free from effort and agitation, the simple draperies, the devotional expression of the faces, all seem to point to the lingering influences of the 15th century. The glazed moldings enclosing the groups and the colored medallions with which the ceilings of the chapels are decorated suggested a direct connection with the later school of the Robias. Wharton was particularly taken with Lo Spasimo, or the Swooning of Mary, which depicts the Virgin Mary swooning at the sight of Christ bearing the cross. She locates clues in the composition of the swooning that confirm her suspicion of the faulty attribution. She explains that inaccurately ascribing these sculptures to a later period effectively relegated them to obscurity in light of prevailing taste for early Italian art. With the help of the director of the Royal Museums in Florence, Wharton correctly identified the figures as the work of Giovanni della Robbia. His dates are here on the slide. Wharton basked in what she called the rare sensation of an artistic discovery, publishing her findings in the essay, A Tuscan Shrine. In so doing, Wharton was dipping her toes into an arguably unwelcoming pool, challenging the acknowledged sage Bernard Berenson, which he did not appreciate. They would eventually become great friends, and today Wharton's attribution is generally accepted as correct. Wharton's love of Italian art remains inseparable from her love of Italy. She conceived of Italy as art in itself. Italy, she writes, quote, to her real lovers is like a great illuminated book with here and there a glorious full-page picture, and between these, page after page of delicately penciled margins wherein every detail of her daily life may be traced. And the pictures in the margins are by the same hand. Italy is for Wharton by turns one long delight, one long enchantment, one long vision of beauty. Writing of Italy to her governess and confidant Anna Ballman, Wharton described it as, quote, more brilliant and picturesque and in every way enchanting than words can express. Wharton describes viewing a painting by Romanino in a church in Brescia like so. She writes, in its presence, one thinks with a pang of all the beautiful objects uprooted from their native soil to adorn the herbarium of the art collector. Here, Wharton expresses her disdain at the American leisure class habit of assembling works of the old masters merely as signifiers of class status. Consumption so conspicuous is critiqued in the Nouveau Riche protagonists of the custom of the country, who, Wharton suggests, are incapable of appreciating the sublime in art. Wharton's distaste for the art of her native country and for much of the art in the homes of wealthy Americans was as strong as her esteem for that of Italy. The prevailing taste among the Americans of Wharton's class at the time of her youth was for copies of didactic European masterpieces. She discloses rather matter-of-factly that the society whose company her parents kept, quote, did not perhaps profit much by the artistic and intellectual advantages of European travel. As a product of her class, time, and her Europeanized upbringing, Wharton was unable to appreciate or even respect American art. She derided the American artworks that adorned the walls of homes of her parents' friends. On seeing John Trumbull's paintings in the Capitol Rotunda, which apparently depict her great-grandfather, Wharton observed, quote, I was vaguely sorry to have anyone belonging to me represented in those still old-fashioned pictures so visibly inferior to the battle scenes of the European masters. She spoke in a 1903 letter to Sally Norton of her difficulty acclimating to the American scene after having been in Italy. Quote, the tastes I am cursed with are all of a kind that cannot be gratified here. As Catherine Joslin and Alan Price have noted, quote, in Europe, American exotics could gratify their glasshouse refinements by placing themselves in close proximity to aesthetically satisfying art, architecture, even urban and rural landscapes pruned into tasteful designs. In America, Wharton found herself an exile, her phrase, disconnected from everything. So it was a shared love of the simple Italian style of architecture and decoration that brought Edith Wharton and Ogden Codman together and inspired them to channel their ideas into the writing of the decoration of houses. Edith would write to Ogden Codman in 1896, in the middle of their collaboration, quote, she says, the fact is that Italy spoils me for everything else. They also would invest this shared love in the early stages of planning and designing her home, the Mount, in Lenox, Massachusetts. In Italian villas in their gardens, Wharton would emphasize Roman art as, quote, the true source of modern architecture. The decoration of houses argues for the limitless possibilities afforded by the appropriate design and decoration of the home. The opening chapter confidently concludes like so, quote, and here they write, it is possible to produce great variety in the decoration of rooms without losing sight of the purpose for which they're intended. Indeed, the more closely this purpose is kept in view, and the more clearly it is expressed in all the details of each room, the more pleasing that room will be, so that it is easy to make a room with tinted walls, deal furniture, and dimity curtains more beautiful because more logical and harmonious than a ballroom lined with gold and marbles in which the laws of rhythm and logic have been ignored. Wharton and Codman were particularly critical of the gilded and marbled ballrooms so out of step with the, quote, laws of rhythm and logic that were being erected by the leisure class across the eastern seaboard in the 1890s. As the decoration of houses makes clear, purpose, form, harmony, and function may all be honored without sacrificing visual pleasure. Wharton and Codman conceived of interior decoration as an architecture in and of itself. They note, for instance, that, quote, all good architecture and good decoration, which it must never be forgotten, is only interior architecture, must be based on rhythm and logic. The decoration of houses, which the New York designer and historian Thomas Jane recently called, quote, the most important decorating book ever written, crystallizes what Wharton and her co-author found to be troubling in American tastes at the turn into the 20th century, and its argument can be summarized in three main points. First, they emphatically insist that, quote, proportion is the good breeding of architecture, claiming with a flourish that, quote, the essence of a style lies not in its use of ornament, but in its handling of proportion. Wharton and Codman advocate European principles of harmony and symmetry, many of which were born of her time abroad and his time having lived in France and traveled in Italy, that would be important to Wharton's life and her work. In both interior decoration and architecture, the authors point out, quote, a regard for symmetry besides satisfying a legitimate artistic requirement tends to make the average room not only easier to furnish, but more comfortable to live in. The effect of form, shapes, and spaces on the individual would be a theme Wharton would consistently treat in her fiction. The book emphasizes proportion and design in furniture, ornament, walls, and all aspects of domestic architecture. In privileging architectural proportion, Wharton and Codman were going against the contemporary grain, which emphasized the superficial application of ornament. The second key point that they make is that by returning to, quote, the best models and traditions of the past, current house decoration can be elevated above its unfortunate status of confusion, decline, and vulgarity. In Italian Villas and Their Gardens, Wharton would further deride, quote, the haphazard and slipshod designs of the present day. And thirdly, Wharton and Codman suggest that those models can be found chiefly in the buildings erected in Italy after the early 1500s and in France and England after the full effect of the Italian influence set in. In her memoir, A Backward Glance, Wharton observes that asking, quote, the clever young Boston architect Ogden Codman to, quote, alter and decorate her Newport house was, quote, a somewhat new departure, since the architects of that day looked down on house decoration as a branch of dressmaking and left the field to the upholsterers, who crammed every room with curtains, lambrequins, etc., gewgaws, festoons of lace on mantelpieces and dressing tables. Wharton here describes the style informing her mother's Victorian drawing room, cluttered as it was with overstuffed furniture, bric-a-brac, gilded cabinets, old lace, painted fans, and busy wallpaper. The introduction to the decoration of houses notes that one of the book's chief purposes is to discourage the over-reliance on the upholsterer who is called in to decorate and furnish the rooms, and the overstimulation of the senses resulting from the decoration of this room is one of the undesired consequences of the practice. Wharton and Codman consider the tendency to turn to the upholsterer instead of the architect to be a major cause of the deficiency of 19th century house decoration. They envisioned house decoration as a branch of architecture, and while they're not suggesting that the architect and the designer must be the same person, they argue that the decorator must conceive of his or her function architecturally, that is, honoring the structural integrity of the room rather than simply adding ornament to it. As a whole, the decoration of houses elevates interior design to a professional, not a merely domestic and feminine activity. Its principles set a new standard for decor, still followed today, and the book has been closely aligned with the birth of interior design in the United States. Wharton managed to repackage the so-called household arts in a way that legitimizes and does not feminize, thus marginalize them. Their book, however, is clearly informed by some short-sighted class assumptions. First, the insistence that proportion is the same thing as good breeding resonates with the patrician undertones associated with the leisure class that Wharton's fiction would indict. The book takes as a given that the reader could afford to import a carved ceiling from Italy, employ live-in servants, and be in the financial position to not only own but decorate a ballroom, a saloon, and so on. Their confidence in a kind of trickle-down aesthetics is evident when they suggest that, quote, when the rich man demands good architecture, his neighbors will get it too. It doesn't always work like that. Wharton and Codman advocated for an architectural style that was decidedly anti-American and anti-nouveau riche as a gesture of contempt for what they saw in the millionaire class of the Gilded Age. They bemoaned America's transition from what they called the Golden Age of architecture to the Gilded Age of decoration. The word vulgar, used to describe the newly moneyed social climbers of her New York novels, appears quite frequently in this book. In fact, an early draft of The Decoration of Houses, and this is one of my favorite edits, an early draft laments the, quote, hopeless quagmire of vulgarity and wrongness into which 19th century architecture and decoration had wandered. Wharton and Codman sought to instill in their readers a more refined sense of good taste, and they illustrated their book with photographs from French, Italian, British homes, and furniture from the 16th to 18th centuries. The book instructed designers how to avoid the pitfalls of the so-called incongruous effects that they recognize in the conspicuous displays of wealth evident in contemporary hotels, public buildings, and millionaires' homes. The conclusion of The Decoration of Houses takes to task the excesses of the Gilded Age, noting with confidence that, quote, this supreme excellence is simplicity. Moderation, fitness, relevance, these are the qualities that give permanence to the work of the great architects. Eleanor Dwight has noted that, quote, although they admired the Italians and their splendid villas and palaces, the authors deemed Italian architecture more appropriate for court functions and suggested that the reader look to 18th century France or England for models for the private house. That particular directive may well have been aimed at the Vanderbilts, whom Wharton knew and to whom she introduced Ogden Codman, and it helps explain her disdain for Isabella Stewart Gardner, who audaciously erected a copy of an Italian villa in the heart of Boston, Massachusetts. The Vanderbilts were responsible, for example, for such august cottages as the Breakers in Newport, the Petit Chateau on Fifth Avenue, and the Vanderbilt Mansion in Hyde Park. In fact, on Wharton's recommendation, Codman oversaw the interior design of the second and third floor bedrooms of the Breakers, and his refined, streamlined style contrasts starkly with the overdone decor of the first floor. In a letter to Codman, Wharton makes clear her conviction that the sort of wealth possessed by the Vanderbilts does not necessarily denote taste. And I quote her, she says, I wish the Vanderbilts didn't retard culture so very thoroughly. They are entrenched in a sort of thermopylae of bad taste from which apparently no force on earth can dislodge them. So that bad taste is on display in Wharton's description in The Custom of the Country of Peter Van Degen's Fifth Avenue mansion. The residence seems to be a loosely veiled reference to the Petit Chateau designed by Richard Morris Hunt in 1883 for William K. Vanderbilt and his wife Alva, which no longer stands. But here's the quote. Here's Wharton in her novel. A muddle of misapplied ornament over a thin steel shell, she says, was built up in Wall Street. The social trimmings were hastily added in Fifth Avenue, and the union between them was monstrous and factitious. Not a compliment. So Wharton and Codman then offered their book as a kind of corrective for the overly ornamental and perversely monstrous mansions, their word, of the robber barons. They also sought to counter the advice offered in two exceedingly popular decorating guides, which they disliked. One is Hints on Household Taste, 1868, by the British architect and designer Charles Locke Eastlake, who established the style name for him. And the second is House Beautiful, 1877, by the American author and critic Clarence Cook. They dismissed both of those books as overly sentimental, unscholarly, and unscientific, and with their book, established rules for domestic law and order that are far more authoritative and continue to resonate today. And I would just playfully suggest that she looks forward to Marie Kondo. Okay, next slide. So Edith Wharton is arguably the only American woman writer to have taught herself art history, architecture, and interior design. Wharton's establishment of herself as an authority on aesthetics and on the art of fiction is all the more impressive, I would argue, given that she did so in a publishing climate that frequently sought to undermine, silence, second guess, and/or pigeonhole her for being a woman. While Wharton's biography shows her to have been a pioneer in many ways, what's less known is that her writings on decoration and design helped clear a path for other women to acquire and exercise authority in this field. She was one of the only women in Europe and the US to hold a significant influence on aesthetics in the early years of the 20th century, as one scholar has noted, and I quote, "In the United States and in Britain, partly inspired by Wharton and Codman's book, interior decoration became established as a profession for women in the interwar years. The decoration of houses prompted a more modern approach to space, color, and detail in interior design, like Elsie de Wolf's restrained, light and airy interiors that were so sought after in the early years of the 20th century. Wharton preferred to think of herself as a professional, not as a professional marginalized by gender, that is, as a writer, not a woman writer, or worse still, a lady writer. She was famously delighted to have been called, with her friend Teddy Roosevelt, a self-made man. Edith Wharton was making her way in a literary profession and an aesthetic field historically dominated by men. After all, a key influence was Vernon Lee, who was born Violet Paget, but who adopted the gender-ambiguous pen name because of her conviction that, and I quote her here, that no one reads a woman's writing on art, history, or aesthetics with anything but unmitigated contempt. So that's Vernon Lee. And yet, most readers would set aside their contempt when they read Wharton's writings on art, history, and aesthetics. Perhaps this is because she resisted all things sentimental. Her treatises on houses and gardens can only be described as scientific, practical, and realistic, which is the same mode of representation she preferred for her fiction. The Decoration of Houses and her book Italian Villas and Their Gardens are scholarly treatments of architecture, design, and gardens worthy of heavy annotations for their copious references to art, history, mythology, philosophy, literature, and so on. A glance at the formidable list of works consulted from Italian, French, English, and German authorities included in these books makes clear Wharton's engagement with serious critics of visual culture and distinguishes her volume from the sort of ladies' guides on domestic decoration that were popular in the 19th century. Although her godson, the art historian Kenneth Clark, undersold Wharton when he applauded her, quote, highly civilized, non-specialist point of view, a cursory review of her corpus confirms that Wharton transformed herself into a specialist on architecture, design, and gardens. Indeed, the French writer Paul Bourget, her friend and peer, aptly said of Wharton that there was, quote, not a painter or a sculptor of whose work she could not compile a catalog. Her respect for and understanding of Italian-themed visual culture permeates not only her prose but also her poetry. She wrote ekphrastic poems inspired by Botticelli, Leonardo, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and Dante Alighieri. Before saying goodnight, I want to say just a few words about Italian villas and their gardens. This is a scholarly study of garden architecture. The book is illustrated by Maxfield Parrish, although Edith Wharton, who was less taken with his dreamy, whimsical images than we are, had emphatically advocated instead for architectural plans. She lost that battle. In writing Italian Villas and Their Gardens, Wharton wished to do justice to a subject that, quote, hitherto had been treated in English only in the most amateurish fashion. Her book, quote, paved the way for architectural students, landscape gardeners, and enthusiasts who followed in her footsteps and paid tribute. I'm quoting Vivian Russell there. Italy, then, was everything to Edith Wharton. She visited it frequently across a 40-year period. Though Wharton made France her permanent home and she never owned property in Italy, the country occupied a central place in her body of work, her heart, and her consciousness. The landscape served as a setting for a number of her literary works, fiction as well as travel writing. A dozen of her short stories rely on Italian settings. Please read Rum and Fever if you haven't. It'll change your life. And her first novel, The Valley of Decision, 1902, is a 2-volume fictional account of the history and politics of 18th century Italy. Quoting Pope Leo X's remarks on Italy, Wharton wrote, and I'm quoting her, "Let us enjoy it." She says, "My experience is that to have the thing one wants ever in life comes to about one mortal in a million. So take Italy with both hands and eat it leaf by leaf." Italy remained alluring and enchanting for the entirety of her life. She marveled in its architecture's, quote, breadth and simplicity of composition. In Italian villas and their gardens, Wharton implores us to visit the Villa Borghese or any comparably splendid Italian site and ask ourselves, quote, "What can I bring away from here?" And the more we study, she says, and compare, the more inevitably the answer will be a sense of the informing spirit, an understanding of the gardener's or the architect's purpose, and of the uses to which he or she meant the creation to be put, close quote. At the age of 73, Wharton marveled at the masterpieces of the Italian exhibition in Paris, experiencing them as a, quote, great tidal wave of beauty. A few years later, shortly before her death, she spoke in a letter to Berenson of yearning to see the Tintorettos in Venice. And in her final reflective hours, she wondered, and I quote her, "Was it ever well to be elsewhere when one might be in Italy?" Grazie. Thank you. She was a great lover of dogs. But I guess there's time for questions or comments. Please, yeah.
Well, I mean, wasn't Italy a very popular visiting spot for people in her era in class?
Yes.
So
Yes.
what was it about her point of view? Was it she just thought they just didn't get it? The essence of
I think so. Yeah. Yeah. I think so. If I understand your question correctly, I think that she thought that she approached it from the point of view of an expert and a specialist, and she was really proud of going to all of the places that the guidebooks might not send you to. Mm-hmm. And one thing that I didn't have time to mention, but it's probably worth mentioning, is that she didn't necessarily love the Italian people. So she had some flaws. So she's absolutely like a product of her era and her class and station and everything. But I think that she approached it from the point of view, and she really called herself a true lover of Italy. So I think she took a kind of an entitlement to her relationship to Italy, and I think she felt that she understood it better than the sort of American like me.
It's getting to seem like you're saying that the other people of her class sort of just, it was just appealing the sort of decorativeness mm-hmm. of Italian art mm-hmm. and the flair, while she really appreciated the classicism, the base of classical art that Italy came through.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, I think you're right. It's a great point.
Thank you.
Along those same lines, what was her relationship with people like Harriet Hosmer, those American women who did settle in Rome and had, I think, a circle of really intellectual camaraderie, right? Did she get along with them? I've never seen
It's a very good question. She was very close to Vernon Lee. She had a great many women friends. I don't know of a close relationship to the woman you're citing here. Most of her friends were men. That's what kind of comes to mind in response to your question. She's very, very close to Vernon Lee, who's British, of course, British born.
No, I was thinking of American women, actually.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
because there was a circle, Hawthorne.
Of course, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Sister.
She had women friends and she had American women friends, but quite honestly, her closest confidants tended to be men. Ogden Common was one of them, Walter Berry, who she called the great love of her life, and we're not sure to what extent. to what extent their relationship was more than just a friendship. But she surrounded her, and of course Henry James, American.
Right.
But you're noticing a theme here that these are men. It's not to
Men.
say she disliked American women, she didn't. But I think that most of her close confidence tended
Well, then,
to be
since
men.
I have the mic, another question. How did she compare Venice to, I know you showed some slides of Venice, but my impression is she spent most of her time in Florence and Rome.
Yes.
Was that
Yeah.
because she considered them artistically more interesting? Of course, they don't have the gardens so much in Venice. but-
Yeah, I mean, I think like a lot of people today, I think that she found Venice a little bit busier than the other cities, and she lived in Florence and in Rome as a younger person, and I don't know that she did live in Venice. And she writes about Venice, and I would encourage everybody, if you're interested at all in Italian gardens, to read her book, Italian Villas and Their Gardens. It's surprisingly accessible to someone who's not a scholar of architecture, which I really am not. I'm kind of training myself to become one. So yeah, she writes about Venice. So I would encourage you to take a look, in fact.
And that's mostly in the villas.
Yeah, but also Italian backgrounds too. Both books, yeah.
She was pretty famous for her note-taking while touring. Did you have access to any of her notes? And if not, where are they all kept?
I don't, and I did not, but it's a wonderful question. The great bulk of her papers are wonderfully down the road at the Beinecke Library at Yale University. However, her papers are also in other collections across the world. There are papers of hers at Princeton at the Lilly Library. But no, I don't have access to her notes. And in fact, even with respect to the decoration of houses, there's only one surviving manuscript, and it's a typed manuscript with some notes on it. But there's no surviving handwritten manuscript for that. So, and I'm not aware of any surviving handwritten manuscript for Italian villas and their gardens. And if you know of one, please tell me, because I'm not aware of the survival of such a document. If you haven't read The House of Mirth, I highly recommend it. It's kind of a life changer, and it's a gift that keeps on giving. And I would also emphasize, and I didn't have time to mention it, but every work of fiction of hers, in every work of fiction, architecture resonates. Every house means something, and it's every work. If you don't have time with The House of Mirth, read the short stories. She published 86 short stories, and they're amazing. And if you love Italy, as I think you do, you must, as I said, read Roman Fever, because it's wonderful, and it's set against the backdrop of the Colosseum.
Thank you, Emily. That was a wonderful talk. So something that makes me curious, and I think you explained it, but maybe I just didn't get it, and that is, so you have Edith Wharton, who loves and appreciates the Baroque.
Yeah.
But then when she looks at her parents' friends' houses, and they see a lot of chintz, or,
Yes.
for lack of better thing, how does she reconcile her love of the Baroque with her dislike of those interiors?
It's a wonderful question. I mean, I think that she would have. I just think she would have looked at the Victorian. Like, first of all, she hated wallpaper, but she didn't always follow her own rules, because she did have wallpaper at the Mount. And if you haven't visited the Mount in Lenox, Massachusetts, it's a wonderful experience. It's a wonderful trip. But I think that she would have seen like the clutter as just conspicuous consumption and ways of flaunting one's wealth, but not having any taste at all. I guess I love your question. I guess I haven't thought of the Baroque as being cluttered in the way that I think. I'm sorry. I just think of it differently. I think of the drama and the light and the use of shadow and Bernini and the perfection of form. I learned about Tiepolo from Edith Wharton. I never knew his work until Edith Wharton. But I think that's how she would reconcile it.
But maybe that's exactly it. It's the drama and the passion versus just a lot of stuff.
Yeah. The busyness of it all, I think. Yeah. So.
Okay, Emily, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Having no further questions,
Yeah.
thank you all for coming.
Thank you.